Thank you to all the guests who have joined us, all those who answered our call to join us today. This discussion is brought together by the Okoa Uchumi Coalition. Okoa Uchumi Coalition comprises of several civil society organizations, and we came together because we are concerned about debt in this country. We have witnessed debt rising since 2013, rising to levels that are extremely high, that have squeezed opportunities for business to borrow. We've seen debt rising to a level that businesses are struggling, revenue is struggling, and government is borrowing to pay debt. So in our view, as the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, we don't think we are okay. And then, of course, we have COVID, and COVID has come and has forced businesses to a standstill, again impacting the economy. The format of today's discussion is really just that. It's a conversation. There are a few questions that I have to kind of prompt the conversation. But to start off, each of our guests will make a brief introductory statement. And this is in line with their work. As we all know, Transparency International works on matters of corruption. And they have also put together a platform called Action for Transparency. And this platform is monitoring COVID funds. And so, Sheila, what is the role of debt transparency in Kenya's COVID response? And how is Kenya performing so far?
Of course, debt transparency is very critical, as you've mentioned. Currently, through our Action for Transparency intervention, we're trying to track the monies coming in to help respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in terms of debt transparency, that information is very beneficial to everyone, to citizens, to the government, to other stakeholders who are supporting response, and because it also gives lenders more certainty about the basis upon which they are lending. It allows us as Kenyans to subject borrowing for COVID-19 to more scrutiny, including through holding public debt audits into borrowing decisions. And such scrutiny is very important to ensure that loans that are given to the government are well utilized, and whatever is funded is well targeted and costed in line with the priorities identified in the response effort. We ensure that lives and livelihoods are safeguarded during this crisis. And debt transparency is priority of government. To be honest, Wanjiru, I am not certain of how much we have been able to get so much, or how much has been loaned so far. In as much as we have been tracking, as I mentioned, we have a tracker through our Action for Transparency portal. But other than reports that IMF had approved the disbursement of $739 to be drawn under the Rapid Credit Facility, and then earlier in April we had the information that $50 million had been approved by the World Bank. It has been really nerve-wracking what have been contributions and what have been received as loans in some instances. So we feel that the government needs to be more transparent on the funds borrowed to finance strategies. We need to know who are the sources, where are these funds coming from, and the liability that comes with these loans, if any, noting that any foreseen difficulty in terms of financial recovery after the pandemic, and considering that it will be citizens who will bear the burden of public debt now and in the future. So by all means, we must about any loan commitments that the government is entering into. It's therefore important that we know exactly how much debt the country has incurred so far and how this money is utilized. And even ahead of this situation, others who have been part of our campaign for debt transparency, you remember that one of the things we have been advocating for is in instituting debt transparency is ensuring that we get critical information on the terms and conditions of these transactions, the amounts, the currency, the interest rates, what the loan is for, and so on. So all this information is very critical at this point. And I think we need to ensure that we have a broad access to information in line with Article 35 of the Constitution and the Access to Information Act. And we also need to have a plan and a strategy detailing COVID-19 response efforts that will ensure that we also get budgets that can be able to scrutinize.
What we wanted to know from you, James, because the Institute for Public Finance works heavily in this area, we have quite a strong legal framework for transparency and accountability in debt management. How well is government complying to this?
Debt compliance by government is still a debate that we are having here. I mean, it's a debate, by parliamentarians, by the civil society, ordinary citizens, and everyone across the street and in offices. But to put this in context, first of all, we need to understand that according to the 2019 census, approximately 12 million households live below poverty line. Now, public debt is part of our revenue as a country. And the question around revenue is a primary domain of parliament. Now, we also need to realize that debt is a singular first charge in our revenues, local revenues that we correct. So, and as we start thinking about government and compliance, then we'll have to look at across the principles of public finance as provided by the Constitution of Kenya. Accountability and transparency, including public finance, equity across generations, openness around that, and fiscal reporting, and the comprehensiveness of reporting. And this whole question, public debt comes to fund a budget, and a budget must be linked. But when you have a problem with a budget, you will ultimately have a problem with your public debt.
Just so that you can conclude, you sounded like you were going somewhere, because the question was, how well are we complying? And you then said if there's a problem with the budget, there'll be a problem with the debt that we procure. Just half a second or half a minute to kind of elaborate, finish that train of thought.
In terms of compliance, we're very much aware that last year, government, first of all, extended the threshold of debt contracting because we had already passed the limit. First of all, we are looking at, first of all, from either a percentage figure of GDP or a numerical figure. We had already gone past compliance levels with regards to the PFM Act. Of course, now we got, legality achieved through Parliament. Having already that, literally, it's a retrogressive legality. You breach and then you unbreach legally. And of course, no one can take that. And of course, Honorable Ichung'wa will tell us what that means for us. And so that means, from that perspective, the breach and compliance fails. And of course, that
right.
We've seen parliamentary reports complaining about reporting. That's another breach. So, with regards to breach of transparency principles, we are doing fairly bad as a country, but there is progress, generally progress. Let's also acknowledge from where we are coming from. Thank you.
So there's some progress, but there are many breaches, and it's fitting that we come to you, Honorable Ichung'wa, because it rests on Parliament, the issue of oversight. And there's a sense where this runaway debt, because we're talking really about an unsustainable debt level, that has taken place during the watch of Parliament. And as James is telling us, the ceiling was raised. Wachira Maina in the AfriCog report calls it repurposing institutions for, state objectives. So you have objectives laid down in the Constitution, but they can be repurposed so that you legitimize something that's not in the public interest. What is your view? How has Parliament performed, and where have the shortcomings been?
Did you call it repurposing what objectives, institutions?
repurposing state institutions. Actually, it's the report talks about state capture, where you have a good legal framework, but you repurpose institutions for private objectives. In this case, these institutions have been repurposed to subvert and sidestep the legal sanctions of the law.
To a large extent, I would agree with Wachira Maina that indeed there has been an element of state capture in this country over the years, and I think I'll just be as bold as I could be on that because it's a fact of life. If you look at the flagship project that you mentioned in introduction and the brief you had sent to me, what are those flagship projects? You indeed, in your own narrative, you called it the president's flagship projects. And if you ask me, in a country like this, we shouldn't be talking about the president's flagship project. There should be flagship projects that will help the country, not flagship projects that are seen as legacy projects for a president, because presidents will come and go, but the nation remains. Well, I appreciate what Muragori is saying, because to a large extent I also agree with him that Parliament has, at least he appreciates there has been some progress. And that progress probably has been the last 2 or 3 years. Before then, I think that repurposing of institutions was very apt in Parliament. Parliament actually was just singing along everything that the executive said. And we got to a point where nobody questions anything. I think if you read the last 2 or 3 parliamentary budget and appropriations committee reports, we have been very emphatic on the question of debt disclosure in terms of disclosing what you are borrowing for, how much you are borrowing, even being specific to the projects that you want to finance and how you want to finance them. We have had problems with the National Treasury, and that is also clearly articulated in all our reports. When I joined the Budget and Appropriations Committee 2 years ago in 2017, 2018, we purposed as a committee that we will ensure there's accountability, there's transparency, not just in debt management, but also in terms of the projects that you want to implement. It's been a long walk to the improvements that Muragori is talking about. And it's not going to be easy, but we have to purpose as a nation. We have a government that is not oversighted by Parliament, as I said before, had been accustomed to singing to the tune of the executive. And therefore, nobody really oversighted what government was doing, and that's how we found ourselves to where we are. In regard to the same repurposing, the increment of the debt ceiling to 9 trillion shillings, I think we're also very emphatic in as a budget and appropriations committee. We disagreed with government last year that there was no need. In fact, we said there was need to increase this debt ceiling, but not to the tune of 9 trillion shillings. And it was our feeling that up to the year 2022, 2023, we could function with about 7.5 trillion. Well, that is a long story again because of the repurposing of institutions again, and it came to pass to 9 trillion shillings. And I think what you should do, and Wanjiru, you'll appreciate, it's not easy for me to join a civil society discussion like this, but I think it's the right thing to do for this country. We also find ourselves in a situation where even you guys in the civil society, I have seen a number of your letters to Parliament, to the National Treasury, copied to our office. But really, other than the letters, we have not had you much. And maybe it's because of the state capture you talk about. Our media stations are also captured by the state. And therefore, even your voices may not be heard. Therefore, you might have to be a little bit more innovative to be heard and to provide more meaningful oversight than those state institutions that probably could be under state capture.
In fact, Honorable Ishongwa, you're laying the setting for us, because that is when we came together with the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, we were responding to this issue of state capture, the issue of lack of oversight. And we could discuss debt, but let's narrow it down now to the COVID context. Government has been forced to borrow, and are you satisfied? And I'll throw this first to James. Are you satisfied that government is clear on where that money is going, the conditions of the borrowing, and who is going to be assisted by that money?
At this particular point, in times of COVID, debt contracting doesn't have, to be the question that we are having. First of all, we need to ask, are there resources available in-house as a country? because debt contracting also, it's an opportunity cost here that, you borrow, you spend, and then the money has to be paid. So what will give? However, at this particular point, we, by the opaqueness of our institutions of public finance means that we are not able to tell exactly what we are contracting for. What we have now at this particular point, until it was verified by IMF, for example, it was a rumor that we are seeking resources. We could hear, here and there that the government is seeking IMF. We've been hearing about the IMF standby credit, the World Bank. There's also rumor that the World Bank is going to give us some bit of more money, but it's still a rumor. When it comes to COVID-19, the question around transparency has really, been shrouded with a lot of mystery. There's a lot of opaqueness around this. And opaqueness in public finance denies a country the opportunity to build trust between citizen and government. Because ultimately, the loans that we contract will have to be paid by citizens. And that asks the question between, around equity between the current and future generation. And Sheila had mentioned this in her opening remarks. So there is still a lot of suspicion around the money that we contracting, if we're contracting a debt. And why are we contracting a debt for COVID-19? That's a question we need to ask ourselves. What are we financing? So we get the IMF standby credit facility coming now. Is it to support our forex exchange reserve? Is it to support the health system? Or is it a lifeline fund for the economy post-COVID? While we're very clear that we know we are only a month away, 2 months away to the end of the financial year. So lack of that clarity then leaves everyone asking where. And of course, we know the primary responsibility of contracting debt and making decisions on revenue is a parliamentary decision. This one we cannot wish away from our parliament. It is their responsibility, right at their door. If it stinks right outside parliament. And because that's the oversight authority, James cannot walk to Treasury and demand, but Honorable Ichung'wah can ask CS, can you give us information on this? But right now, where we are, the opaqueness is still at a very high level.
Right, you said that, and Sheila also mentioned the same frustration in trying to get details about these funds. And the question you're asking, and I think on many Kenyans' minds, is what is the money being borrowed going towards? And perhaps, Mheshimiwa, are you able, from your point of view as Parliament, are you clear what the money will be used for?
We have an engagement this coming Thursday, the day after tomorrow, with the National Treasury, basically to have a discussion around that debt issue, especially the 75 billion shilling that just came in, or 75 or 79 billion thereabout. We had sought information on the initial amount of 5 billion shillings, which was actually 6 billion shillings, not even 5 billion shillings. And that they did indicate that they have already received that money from the World Bank. I don't recall whether this was supposed to be a grant, because someone mentioned whether, I think it's Sheila who said we need to be able to know what is coming in as debt, what is coming in as grants or support towards COVID. And I think the 5 billion might have been a grant or just very concessional support towards the fight against COVID. However, the 79, to the best of my understanding, is coming in as budgetary support because of the shortfall in revenues occasioned by the impact of COVID-19 to the economy. So far, in terms of ordinary revenue, we had a shortfall of almost 123 billion shillings. The tax measures announced by His Excellency the President in terms of trying to mitigate the suffering of the people in terms of pay-as-you-earn VAT also are occasioning another very huge shortfall in our revenues to the tune of almost about 127 billion in this last quarter of this financial year. Next year, probably to even be worse than that. Therefore, there was need to come in to try and get in support. And I think that's what IMF is now bringing the 75 billion shillings for, to cushion you against what you are losing in terms of revenue. And I think that is where the challenge will be, because inevitably we have been in a regime where we've been talking about fiscal consolidation. But I think you all know it's been more of talk than real fiscal consolidation. And if we are not able to achieve that real fiscal consolidation, and it might be more difficult now with COVID-19, because there'll be expenditure pressures, like in healthcare, there are pressures to spend more. There's pressure to spend more in the form of Kenyans asking for food and stipends, some even asking government to pay rent for them. Therefore, in view of the pressure that will be there for expenditure, the fiscal consolidation may not again be a reality as such. And therefore, it will further strain our debt position, and we might still have to go out and borrow. And I had seen a question in your write-up asking, what are the options? And I think I have maintained all along since the beginning of COVID in mid-March, that one of the very quick options we have is to renegotiate our debt. You are all aware that this year, for instance, this year, 2019-2020, almost 700 billion shillings is going towards debt repayment, both capital redemption and interest payments. About 162 billion shillings towards interest alone on foreign debt. Therefore, if you're able to renegotiate this debt, even the interest element of it, the next financial year projects about 173 billion. If you're able to even suspend the repayment of that interest, that 173 billion, since it's revenue that you're getting from this country and expatriating it to foreign countries to repay debt, then you'll be able to use that money that you have raised locally and be able to spend it on whatever other expenditures you need here. Therefore, one of the options that the government has is to renegotiate debt, be it capital redemption of interest. They have no choice but to go out and aggressively try and renegotiate.
You mentioned the issue of expectations of Kenyans. Of course, the government president announced some tax relief measures, and a month later, through the finance bill, those measures will be undone. And in our mind, first of all, what has the government, what commitment is there? Is the government throwing Kenyans under the bus on COVID? Because it sounds like they are telling Kenyans, "Gisort." Are we really going to get support for those people who have been rendered jobless? Are we going to expect support for those households that don't have food? Is there that level of support? The Parliamentary Budget Office actually has raised some concern, because they say that the 2021 proposed estimates, budget, the government is committing 2.1 billion to the fight against COVID. So it's
2.6.
Is it 2.6? Okay.
2.6 only.
So it's as though government is saying COVID has happened, Kenyans gisort, as we'll move on with business as usual. So even before we talk about renegotiation, which has to happen, the COVID response, is it really there? Or is government listening more to IMF? Or are they more interested in the infrastructure projects?
I think, Wanjiru, you have to, and we all have to appreciate that COVID is something new. Nobody expected COVID. And therefore, I think the situation that Treasury, and I'm not speaking for Treasury, I'm just speculating from the small engagements I've had with the officers there, that they prepared the next year's financial estimates without COVID in mind. And therefore, even the 2.6 billion looks like something that was just thrown in because COVID is here. And they had, between the time COVID came into Kenya in mid-March and end of April, when they needed to submit the estimates, they had already prepared the estimates. And they prepared the estimates from February throughout the month of March. And therefore, they were really not able to do much. And that's the engagement that we sought to have with them this Thursday. Ordinarily, we would have to engage with the National Treasury at the end of the review of the estimates. But we, and I said that in a statement that I did in Parliament on Thursday, that they have done a very ordinary budget in extraordinary times. And we therefore sought to have an engagement with them so that we can look at these estimates as early as now, so that they're able to engage with the other line ministries. What needs to be corrected in these estimates to be corrected as early as now. Otherwise, there would be no point concluding a budget process now. Then a month or 2 months down the line, we will have to do the first supplementary budget to incorporate things that we should have incorporated now. Same thing, Wanjiro, when we were doing the finance bill, the tax amendment laws last month, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I stated it in Parliament that I would support the tax measures announced by His Excellency the President, but with caution. That what we are doing by, for instance, reducing VAT from 16 to 14% would be counterproductive to the economy. We were going to lose close to 50 billion shillings in 1 quarter. And I said then, for me, I would rather you raise the revenue of 50 billion shillings and use it to give stipends of 5,000 shillings probably to 10 million Kenyans who are vulnerable. Therefore, you do not see anything in this estimates that is going towards support of the vulnerable. We are doing a lot of PR with COVID. We are telling Kenyans that, yes, we are supporting the vulnerable in our communities, but who are these vulnerable? What we are calling vulnerable are the elderly, those above 65 years of age who are getting the social protection funds. And who are still going to get the social protection funds whether or not there was COVID. Therefore, if you are talking about supporting the vulnerable today with COVID, it is talking about supporting Wanjiro or Kimani, who was employed as an accountant somewhere in an airline that is not flying, or Wanjiro who was working in a flower farm somewhere in Naivasha and has been retrenched. Someone who was able yesterday to provide for their families, but they are not able to do that. We have a new class of vulnerable people that nobody is thinking about.
Mheshimiwa, let me bring in James. Because IPFK went to prepare a petition on public participation, I think 2 months ago, because of similar, sentiments. And James, maybe you can tell us, in your view, what's the public's role in the COVID response? And you've been making submissions to Parliament, we can say perennially. And very well thought out contributions. And are these being taken up in any way, shape, or form in terms of influencing the COVID response to government?
Public participation, it's got to a point also where we feel, from a think tank perspective, because the Institute of Public Finance is a think tank and we generate evidence around public finance management. And this evidence is what we use to inform the public finance management environment, under which we believe that there's still a long way to go. So to a greater extent, public participation has become very tokenistic. There is the box to be ticked by law, and it needs to be ticked. But within that particular component, once it's ticked, first of all, you'll find National Treasury won't give you probably feedback. But I've said for over the last 1-2 years, there has been some improvement, but then it's very selective improvement. At what point do we want this information given back to citizens as feedback? We will know. And for example, let me first of all pick, in this time of COVID, for example, when you think about access to information, we've just released the Open Budget Survey, for example, last month, on Kenya's transparency with regards to budget, access to comprehensiveness of information in the budget process. Kenya has improved from 46 to 50 score out of 100. We're ranking 5th in Africa and 49th globally. But there's still a lot because Treasury does not make the information that citizens need publicly available. You have to keep pushing, and even Parliament is struggling. And one of the recommendations, for example, in the budget policy statement for this financial year 2020-21 by the Budget and Appropriations Committee, which Ishungwa chairs, is it's the frustration when they request for information on projects being funded by donors, by loans, for example. It's in the report. So when we think about COVID and people are asking for this information, then we know, and especially because it's an emergency. And because our constitution and the contingency fund and the emergency laws give a lot of leeway to the executive wing of government to do much more, and then come and ask for permission from citizens, then you find the struggle that citizens will have. But I still believe there is hope, and I'm very happy with the what is happening in Parliament, because the scales in eyes are falling, and now Parliament is calling out and saying, let it whatever be done. And I think that's what we've been missing, that somebody, the oversight role of Parliament, as a citizen who does oversight for government institutions and generates evidence of where government is failing, we are happy when we hear Parliament calling out the executive. We are very happy when we see Transparency International release a report and saying government is failing on these particular points with regards to corruption. We are not making progress. When such institutions, both state and non-state actors, start calling out government, then there is hope. Because first of all, there is no government money. It is taxpayers' money.
So Sheila, I think that's the right point to bring you in. Do you feel that there is, some progress or some good opportunities for accountability, or are we being too optimistic here?
There's always an opportunity to institute the necessary accountability measures, which we have sung about for years. And even now with this current situation, this is a very good opportunity for us to strengthen. The same way we're using this opportunity to strengthen our health systems is the same way this presents an opportunity for us to strengthen our accountability measures. And just speaking to what some of the issues Mheshimiwa has mentioned at the moment, and your question on what are we seeing that the none less than the president can make a declaration of measures to be undertaken to push on wananchi, but then when you see the legislative proposals, they're speaking to the contrary. It just gives you, it's an indication really that we need a plan. So far I've not seen a detailed strategy on how as a country we're going to combat COVID-19. We've had various measures that have been announced, almost every other day or every week, either by the president or by the CS for health and other officials involved. But I've not seen a combined, strategy document saying this is our plan. And that's the reason why you would see that measures are announced today by the president, but when we see the proposals the next week, we are not seeing them speak to what have been proposed. So I think that we need to have a strategy, and that strategy will also inform the kind of resources that we need, and also inform us as we look for these resources. How much do we need to raise? How much do we need to borrow? We could be borrowing and we actually don't need to borrow. But that we need to see the strategy and the interventions that the government has mapped out. What are the key areas of need? What are the populations that actually really require assistance at this point? And what kind of assistance or measures should be taken to support Kenyans in need? So until we see a detailed strategy, then we fear that we will not have the requisite accountability. So we need to see a strategy articulating the response actions, both at the county and national level, and budgets in line with the response actions mapped, the sources of funding, revenue raising measures and strategies, and so that we can be able to institute accountability measures. And I think we also still have an opportunity to ensure that we have adequate access to information, as I mentioned, in line with Article 35 of the Constitution and the Access to Information Law. And one of the things that we have been calling for is a public information portal. And now as we talk about the question of debt, borrowing to help us respond to COVID-19, one of the key critical information that we would need on that portal which should be accessible to all members of the public is, for instance, information on money that we're borrowing through loans, money that is coming in to support COVID-19 through loans, or whether it's funds raised, and indicating those requisite details that we need when in regard to debt. And all expenditure information should also be detailed to the T. We've had questions on the kind of information that we're getting on the amount of money that has been spent so far. Kenyans need to have the confidence and assurance that the funds are being utilized prudently, but we will not get the confidence that our monies are being used prudently. We will not get the confidence to even dig into our pockets and support the response measures currently if we don't get that assurance that our funds are being utilized prudently. So I think we have opportunities. I'm happy that Mheshimiwa has said that even as Parliament, They have tried to step up in terms of oversight and ensure that there are checks and balances. Of course, we've had questions before about the Parliament's oversight role, but I say that Parliament should continue then to demand detailed information in regard to the COVID-19 expenditure presented to Parliament, and ensure that all expenditure incurred in the response efforts is also subjected to internal audits and other forms of periodic audits. And while we're speaking of auditing, and now that Mheshimiwa is here, I would like to urge him also to urge Parliament to keenly follow through and cause the conclusion of the selection and appointment of an Auditor General. We haven't had one almost a year now, and this process is long overdue. We need to conclude it, so that we fear that in the absence, with that vacuum in that office, this may affect many oversight processes in the long run, including accountability for the COVID-19 funds.
Thank you so much for that, Sheila, because you've talked about the need for a plan. So government hasn't really told us what their bigger plan is, when they borrow, why they're borrowing, where it's going. And you've also talked about the need for a portal. And the reason I've reiterated that is we have some questions. There's Timothy, Jacob, Kimenda, and Churchill Suba. And in fact, they were asking the same questions that you've asked, which is Timothy's asking, do we need to borrow? Government hasn't really told us why they're borrowing, and they're not able to make savings or redirect money from elsewhere. Jacob Kimenda asks the same question, but also talks about the issue of transparency via the portal. And as does Churchill, he talks very good comment on the need for a portal. So, and then I'll add one other thing that Josephine Yamai is talking about. Should we cap development expenditure? So what I'd like to do is turn this, open it up for Mheshimiwa and for James. Sheila has really laid the ground saying that government hasn't really told us what, beyond troubleshooting, they haven't really told us what they want to achieve with the COVID response. And Mheshimiwa, when you go to meet the Minister of Finance, the Treasury on Thursday, are you going to be asking what their strategy is? We were promised a portal. Has this, and this hasn't materialized. Other countries had their portals up, within a couple of weeks, they were tracking expenditure. We are 2 months, and in fact, government looks like they're exiting. It's just that the cases have refused to go down. Government was looking like they're, talking about post-COVID, and we still don't have a portal. And then there are countries, and I think the expectation of many Kenyans was you would hear government would come out clearly and say, we're going to stop certain non-essential spending in the budget, like cap, put a moratorium on of course, unnecessary borrowing, but also on development expenditure. So I'd like to open up these points that have been raised to you, Mheshimiwa, James, and also Sheila can chime in.
And I think I want to agree with Sheila that there is need for a detailed strategy and plan on what you need to do, where expenditures are going to in terms of COVID, what is going into healthcare, how much is going to support the vulnerable, those who are already vulnerable because of their poverty levels, and the new class of vulnerables, people who are previously employed and engaged economically and now they're out of jobs. We have that problem, and I must admit, and that's one of the reasons that I said we have asked the National Treasury to have an engagement with us as early as now. I'll shock you, and that's why I agree with Sheila. The president did announce a 5 billion shillings grant going to counties, or an additional 5 billion shillings that was to go to counties in terms of COVID response. And stipends that were to be given to vulnerable people in Nairobi. When the supplementary 2 budget was tabled before Parliament, it was in Parliament for over 2 weeks. The National Treasury, in those supplementary estimates, had nothing to do with the 5 billion shillings announced by the president, had nothing to do with the stipends that the president announced, until the last day when we were on the floor concluding the supplementary appropriations bill, is when we got a letter asking us to include the 5 billion shillings and 1 billion shillings for stipends. And it was too late, we couldn't. And we advised them, probably you could go use Article 223 of the Constitution, pay and come for post facto approval. But that tells you how unprepared the executive is, how they lack a strategy on what needs to be done, that you need to agree that we need to support counties with 5 billion shillings. But remember, you're also saying that you want to support counties with 5 billion shillings with one hand, and on the other hand, you are taking away, they have brought a proposed amendment to the Division of Revenue Bill purporting to reduce the shareable revenue going to counties by 30 billion shillings. And I was asking them, why then don't you just recover the 5 billion from the 30 that you intend to reduce? And we have those challenges that even Article 219 of the Constitution doesn't allow, really, in our own interpretation. And I think in the reading of that article of the Constitution, even from the Parliamentary Budget Office, you cannot reduce what has been agreed on shareable revenue between the two levels of government. In terms of having a portal, I think that is a challenge that government needs to take up. We pride ourselves to be very up to date in terms of our tech skills in this country. The IFME system is always getting a lot of money in our budget systems. Why the portal is not up, I think, is some of the issues that we need to speak about in terms of transparency and government being able to avail information when it is required. Even for Parliament, we have to ask for information. Information will never be availed to you. Last case example, we have the Jane Karuku Fund. We have other funds, the 5 billion shillings. Remember the 6 billion shillings coming from the World Bank. There was some 7.224 billion that came from Central Bank of Kenya, you remember? There was some 2 billion shillings that came from the anti-corruption agencies. Where is this money? Who can tell you where that money is? When we expected that when they brought the appropriations bill, this money would be in the appropriations bill. And it was in there. And when we asked why you have already received some certain amounts of money, and we can count the 2 billion, the 7 billion, the 5 billion from the World Bank. The only thing that they could account for was the 5 billion from the World Bank in terms of what they are planning to do with it. The rest, we were told, will be put, they're accumulating it in a fund, in the words of the Cabinet Secretary, that they were accumulating it in a fund where they would be able to expand later. And I think is what I want to, again, to agree with you, Anjiro, that without a plan, we are just waiting to see what happens next. And therefore, they say they're accumulating all this money into a fund. And if you look through the report that we tabled in Parliament 2 weeks ago when we did the supplementary appropriations bill, we were very emphatic that all funds that have been designated for COVID, for the fight against COVID, must be appropriated and oversighted by Parliament. Because these kind of funds that you create and accumulate funds on a side pocket somewhere without any accountability, nobody knows how much is going to those kitties, how it is being utilized. And we said, even the appropriation, legally, they must come through Parliament. We cannot have funds being set aside and we are being told information will come later. Therefore, we'll be emphatic from our end, and I think the rest of Kenyans need also to play their role in oversighting government. It's your money.
You know, I want to, first of all, look, and the question of transparency here comes to play very, very much. But the first question we need to ask ourselves, is it possible for government to open up the loan contracts? Because even Parliament doesn't seem, and we understand, they are gatekeepers. We could be, asking these things, but even Parliament cannot access these things sometimes because of the vested interests. But with open contracting, government of Kenya is a signatory to international, agreements and treaties, and agreements where in terms of open contracting, and part of open contracting, the question we're asking, for example, right now, as Mheshimiwa has said, we need to ask ourselves the money that, the money that we are getting. First of all the money that checks into this country straight goes to the Consolidated Fund Services account. There are no shortcuts. And of course, that's where we had our problems, for example, with the Eurobond and the rest. Where did the money pass through that we cannot trace where this money is? And with the lack of a substantive auditor, like now we would have Parliament already said to the Office of the Auditor General, can you start auditing us? Can you give us progress reports on the COVID? Because COVID is going to be, it's not a short-term thing. We have to ask about funding COVID from a health perspective and an economic perspective.
Yeah.
And primarily, we have to recognize that COVID is it's not an economic crisis, it's a health crisis. Because we have to deal with the economy once we are done with the health crisis. So that's one question to ask about our loan contracts. And it is on record that, for example, the major contracts will be made publicly available, which we are still waiting years later to see these contracts. And it is very important because, like I said, there is no government money. It's just taxpayers' money. It's your money and I, as a citizen in Kenya, who requires this. And of course, I keep saying that we must also be very wary of international institutions like IMF. And I'm always happy to call them out. Because over many years, IMF has been singing the way our debt is sustainable. But all of a sudden says, no, your debt is not sustainable. And based on, for example, Parliamentary Budget Office analysis, by 2020, this financial year, the money we will contract to fund 2020 will have got into a distress level as a country. We have passed all the thresholds of a sustainable debt system in a country. And we agree, we have very brilliant civil servants working in this economy. But then the politics around our debt contracting is what we need to look at and also ask ourselves. I'm also again looking at the amount of money that domestically is held by our banks. The reason why we are not going to progress is, as part of state capture, is also how much banks capture us as a country. The banks, banks hold, more than 50% of our domestic debt. Now they are giving us money, for COVID. You see them giving us money for COVID, but it's like gambling. In a gambling scenario, you have the owner of the gambler, take money from 1 million people and then they gives 1 million to one person, and everybody thinks they can win. Yeah, that is essentially what we have with our banks, and we need to ask ourselves a question around debt contracting. Domestic debt contracting, how that is affecting our everyday life in terms of revenues as a country.
Yeah, but James, so what are you proposing? There's a question coming in: is a debt moratorium feasible at this time? Is a cap on development feasible at this time? You're talking about the kind of the monetary rules that have and fiscal decisions government has made that has put a lot of money into the hands of banks. So what needs to happen?
Let me first of all say that, especially around this time, there's no much purchasing power. People are not purchasing, so there's shrunk demand. So first of all, things that Treasury needs, for example, to look like is open up the domestic borrowing to allow citizens who have money that they feel that they can put that money to the government system, they can lend that money to government. Government-lending instruments are still secure instruments. And that's so that we diversify our sources of domestic borrowing from just the mainstream institutions. The other thing is we need to have a disaggregated data, monthly data, with regards to our debt. We need gazette notice on debt disbursement to government institutions. Who are the beneficiaries of? And these are some of the things either that can be done administratively or legally through parliament. When the parliamentarians look at our rules, we need to ask ourselves, when we contract a loan, who is the beneficiary? Because the reason, for example, if you go, I take you back to NYS, is we still don't know who was the beneficiary of the money from NYS. Because it comes and there is no. But you see, if you look at the way government releases the exchequer statement every month via gazette notice, we want to see debt as instruments of revenue instruments being given that priority, because we know how the impact it has as a country. And of course, in the long term, we have that draft public debt policy framework that needs to enshrine the independence of the debt office. We need to consider that as an independent debt office over the long term. And it's not very long term. It's because we already have the draft public policy. It's something that Parliament also needs now to start taking up, enshrining that in the law. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. Sheila, from you, what's the way forward?
I think
you've already told us about the Auditor General. Thank you for reminding us about that, and hopefully Mheshimiwa can also speak a little bit to that. But what needs to happen?
In terms of what we can do, because Mheshimiwa has challenged us also as citizens to play oversight. But just a disclaimer that for Kenyans to be able to oversight, currently our hands are tied without full access to information on debt and other financial information at this point. So it would be useful for him to also help us just push, and other MPs to help us push for access to information. And particularly in regard to public debt management at this time, I think Parliament should not leave the executive unchecked as money is borrowed to support response efforts, and should thus ensure scrutiny in public debt management. And if citizens have this kind of information, then together we can also help perform that critical oversight. I think there's also an opportunity in terms of what the government can do is to open up public debt management by ensuring that this information is out there. Can we, for instance, have a debt register? We can start with information on what's coming in for COVID. I know we've been pushing for a debt register historically for a long time. But for now, just a simple way to start off, can we get details on the lenders, the terms and conditions of the transactions, the amounts, the interest rates, and so on. So, and how these loans will be governed, the immunities, the collateral, dispute resolution information, and other critical information on debts that have been acquired. And we need this kind of information for us also as citizens to be able to perform the requisite oversight. And I will just echo again what James has said, that the government should complete the enactment of the debt policy and borrowing framework, especially now in line with the COVID-19 realities. I think those are critical things that should happen now. But just as I conclude, that we cannot be able to ensure that citizens are engaged, that there's public participation, that there's oversight from the citizens as well, without access to critical information.
There are lots of loopholes. We don't have the AG in place. We don't have the debt policy in place. So the procurement of debt is not happening through an independent body. There's a lot of influence on Treasury in terms of this debt management office capabilities. We don't have the information. So we kind of, and we don't really have a COVID plan. So Mheshimiwa, I'll give you the hardest point. Yeah, you work for the people, so you can deal with hard questions. Where do we take this? Where do we take this?
Let me start with the easiest two. Being the appointment of the Auditor General, I think we can't overemphasize that point. And indeed, as much as that process has been ongoing for over a year now, because the Auditor General left office in August last year. And I think there was a lacuna in law in terms of how we even appoint that Auditor General. I am personally uncomfortable, and I'm an accountant by training. I am uncomfortable with a situation where we have an Auditor General who is being appointed via a panel of people that he will come to audit. And maybe that is why we have seen this problem of the Auditor General coming into office, because maybe the people in the panel want somebody who will play ball with them. And therefore, one of the things that I am working on as a member of Parliament now representing Kikuyu North as Chairman Budget is to work on legislation that will ensure that Parliament, it is Parliament as an institution that hires the Auditor General, not a panel of civil servants who will then be audited by the same Auditor General. Because the Auditor General reports to Parliament. It's Parliament that should directly hire the Auditor General, and without having to go through the panels. And I think that, for me, would be the best thing. In terms of access to information, again, I think Parliament has been very emphatic with the passage of the Access to Information Act. And I think it's just for Kenyans to, and more so you guys in the civil society and the judiciary, to enforce, because the laws are there, the legislation is there, that when you request for information from government, it is not a choice for government or Treasury to give you this information. It is a right. And a constitutional right to get information that you want, especially regarding your money, taxpayers' money, not government money, because it's your money. Therefore, that I think it's just a follow-up and implementation of laws that are already there. You have a huge role, civil society, to agitate for that. In terms of an independent debt office, I had hoped this is something that would live as a legacy. Our term as a budget committee, if I am not removed before, as is happening now, our term comes to end at the end of this financial year, and we had hoped that as a committee we had committed to ourselves that we would ensure that by the end of our term, and we'll still work on it even with COVID going on and the limited times of meeting, to ensure that we have an independent debt office, independent of the Treasury. As it is today, the debt office is a small department in the National Treasury, and we think it ought to be an independent office that can report to Parliament, and Kenyans can walk to and demand for that information that people want to get on our public debt. Therefore, on whether it's possible to have a moratorium on debt now, I think there's nothing bad with trying. We should be the first countries to try. We have borrowed a lot from the Chinese. I think we should be engaging with them. We should be engaging with the French, the Italians, the Germans, some of our largest bilateral donors, to try and make them understand the situation that we are in. If we wait for everybody to go and ask for this debt moratorium, maybe you'll all go at the same time. So I hope government has been listening, and they are already doing this. I do hope they are already doing that. Whether you can stand by some of the development projects, yes, I think it's an option that you can look at. Those development projects that you don't have to do now, it might be one of the things that you may need to do because there are maybe new projects that you intend to start this year, and nobody will die if you start them in the next financial year or 2 years down the line. Therefore, the hard decisions that you have to make, and I think as by the time we come to the conclusion of where COVID will take us, I think the hard realities will hit us so hard that some of these things that we're talking about, whether to renegotiate debt, whether to stop some of our development expenditure, whether to do away with some of our recurrent expenditure, are not choices that we'll have to make. We will be forced to make them. Probably let's start thinking now what we need to do before circumstances force us to do them.
Thank you very much. Sheila Masinde, Acting Executive Director at Transparency International, James Muraguri, ED with the Institute for Public Finance Kenya, and Honorable Ishungwa, Chair of the Budget and Accounts and Appropriations Committee. Thank you so much for your time. Access to information is a right, and especially in matters of public finance, including debt. But of course, what we are saying here is that we are very far from the realization of that right. And it calls on all of us, citizens, civil society, members of parliament alike, to push for the accountability around our public finances, because the writing is on the wall. This thing is going to hit us, it's going to come for us, and if we're not careful, it will sweep us away. So we have a small window in which to act. Thank you so much for giving up your evening. Thank you for all of you who joined us on this call. Aluta continua. Have a lovely evening.